A man saved a stray German shepherd. Days later, he realized the dog had a secret. The rain pelted down on the muddy roadside as Daniel Carter drove his rusty pickup truck along the winding forest road. The ex-military man turned wildlife rescuer squinted through the windshield, his calloused hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. That's when he saw it, the dark mass huddled by the side of the road. He pulled over and hopped out, the cold rain stinging his withered face. As he approached, he realized it was a dog, a German shepherd, battered and malnourished. Daniel's heart clenched. He couldn't leave the poor creature out here to fend for itself. "Hey there, buddy," he said softly, slowly extending a hand. "I'm not going to hurt you." The dog looked up at him with wary eyes, but remained still as Daniel gently scooped him up and carried him to the truck. He grabbed an old blanket from behind the seat and wrapped the shivering animal in it. "Don't you worry," Daniel murmured as he climbed back in the driver's seat. "We'll get you fixed up in no time." Little did he know that a simple act of kindness would change the course of his life forever. The dog in his back seat held secrets that powerful people would kill to keep buried. But all that mattered to Daniel in that moment was getting the poor creature to safety, dried off and fed. The rest could wait. The next morning, shafts of sunlight peeked through the curtains of the small cabin Daniel called home. He yawned and stretched, then remembered his new houseguest. He pulled on a flannel and jeans and padded into the living room. The German shepherd was curled up on the rug by the fireplace, finally dry and looking more at peace. At the sound of Daniel's footsteps, he raised his head, ears perked. "Morning, buddy," Daniel said with a smile. "Bet you could use some breakfast, huh?" He filled a bowl with kibble and refreshed the water dish he'd set out the night before. The dog approached almost tentatively at first, then began wolfing down the food. "Easy, easy," Daniel chuckled. "No one's going to take it from you. How about we give you a name? Since it looks like you'll be staying a while. How do you feel about Max?" The newly christened Max paused and looked up at him, almost as if he understood. His warm brown eyes held a deep intelligence. This was no ordinary stray. Daniel frowned slightly, a thought tickling the back of his mind. He'd seen dogs like this before, back in his army days. The highly trained K9 units, with their laser focus and uncanny perceptiveness. Could Max be one of those dogs? But what would a dog like that be doing all the way out here, abandoned and left for dead? He shook his head. Maybe he was just imagining things. But as he watched Max lick the bowl clean, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this dog's story. Secrets hidden behind those soulful eyes. Well, Daniel had never been one to pry. Everyone had things in their past they'd rather forget, Lord knows he did. All that mattered now was that Max was safe. The rest could stay buried, as far as he was concerned. Over the next few days, Daniel focused on nursing Max back to health. Regular meals, walks in the fresh forest air, gentle care for his wounds. Slowly but surely, the dog began to recover his strength. And with that strength came glimpses of the highly trained animal he must have once been. It started small. The way Max would sit at attention, eyes locked on Daniel, awaiting a command. The almost eerie stillness with which he could hold a position. Then there was the time a squirrel darted across their path and Max took off like a shot, not in a normal dog's exuberant chase, but in a focused, calculated pursuit. As if he'd been trained for it. Daniel watched it all, questions piling up in his mind. But still, he didn't push. If Max wanted to keep his secrets, that was his business. Daniel had grown rather fond of the loyal German shepherd. There was something about having him around that made the quiet life in the woods a little less lonely. But the past has a funny way of catching up with you, no matter how far you run. It started with the prickling feeling of being watched. Daniel would look up from his work in the garden to see a strange vehicle parked on the road, too far for him to make out the driver. But as soon as he took a step toward it, it would pull away. Then came the strange sounds in the night, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the unmistakable rhythm of footsteps circling the cabin. Daniel tried to brush it off as animals, but Max's raised hackles and quiet growls told a different story. Something was out there, and it was watching them. Daniel didn't know what Max was mixed up in, but one thing was becoming increasingly clear: the dog's secrets were catching up with them. And those secrets, Daniel sensed, were the kind that could get you killed. The morning dawned gray and cold, tendrils of mist snaking between the trees. Daniel sipped his coffee and watched Max pace by the door, ears pricked, a low whine building in his throat. "What is it, boy?" Daniel asked, frowning. "What do you hear?" Just then, 3 sharp knocks rang out from the front door. Max's whine turned to a growl, his hackles standing on end. Daniel set down his mug and reached for the pistol he kept in the drawer by the sink. Old habits die hard. Gun in hand, he crept to the front window and peered out from behind the curtain. A woman stood on his porch, mid-30s, with short dark hair and a grim expression. She was dressed practically in jeans, boots, and a weathered leather jacket. But what caught Daniel's attention was the badge glinting on her belt. She was a cop. He tucked the gun in the back of his waistband and opened the door, keeping his body blocking the entryway. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. The woman's eyes flicked past him into the cabin before settling back on his face. "Daniel Carter?" she asked. At his nod, she continued, "I'm Detective Sarah Whitmore. I'm here about the dog." Daniel tensed, his grip tightening on the doorframe. "What about him?" Sarah's gaze cut to where Max stood rigid behind him, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "That's my dog," she said. "His name is Maverick. And he's been missing for over a month." Daniel stared at her, his mind reeling. Maverick. The dog had a name. An owner. And judging from the badge on Sarah's belt, a history he was only beginning to scratch the surface of. He stepped back slowly, letting her in. "Max, no," Maverick sniffed the air as she approached, his tail giving a tentative wag. Sarah crouched down, emotion swimming in her eyes as she held out a hand for him to smell. "Hey, buddy," she murmured. "I've been looking everywhere for you." She looked up at Daniel, and he saw the weariness and worry in her face. "We need to talk," she said. And just like that, Daniel found himself pulled into a world of secrets and shadows, corruption and crime. A world where the only thing standing between him and the danger lurking in the dark was a loyal dog with a hidden past and a detective with a mission. The storm was coming. And it was already at his door. The coffee Daniel poured was strong and black, the bitter aroma filling the small kitchen. He set a mug in front of Sarah where she sat at the table and took a seat across from her. Maverick lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, brown eyes tracking Daniel's every move. "Start from the beginning," Daniel said. "What happened?" Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm mug, her gaze distant. "We were investigating a criminal syndicate," she began, her voice low and tense. "A nasty operation, deep in everything from drugs to human trafficking. It's run by a man named Victor Langley. On the surface, he's a respectable businessman. But underneath..." She shook her head. "He's a monster." Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his stubbled jaw. "And Maverick? Where does he come into this?" "He's my partner," Sarah said simply. "Has been for years. We were closing in on Victor, getting ready to make a move. But someone tipped him off. He set a trap." Her fingers tightened around the mug, knuckles going white. "There was a raid. It went bad. I got separated from my team. From Maverick. I thought..." Her voice caught. "I thought I'd lost him." Daniel looked down at the dog, understanding dawning. "But he survived. And he's been trying to find you." Sarah nodded. "Victor's men must have left him for dead. But you found him." "More like he found me," Daniel said with a wry smile. It faded as the gravity of the situation sank in. "Sarah, if what you're saying is true, this Victor guy isn't going to just let this go. If he finds out you're alive, that Maverick is alive." "I know," Sarah said grimly. "That's why I have to finish this." I have to take Victor down once and for all. And I need your help to do it. Daniel met her gaze, saw the steel of determination there. He thought of all the evil he'd seen in the world, the shadows that clung to him no matter how far he ran. Maybe this was his chance to do something good. To make a difference. He reached across the table, laid his hand over Sarah's. Tell me what you need. Over the next few days, Daniel's quiet cabin became the center of a covert operation. Sarah's team, what was left of it, arrived in unmarked cars, filing into the small space with grim faces and steely resolve. There was Mike, Sarah's partner, a broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut and a scar on his cheek. Jenna, their tech expert, with her shock of purple hair and a laptop perpetually under her arm. And Tom, the rookie, all nervous energy and eagerness to prove himself. They pored over maps and documents spread across Daniel's kitchen table, speaking in low, urgent tones. Maverick wove between them, his presence a steadying force, a reminder of what they were fighting for. And fight they did. In whispered phone calls and encrypted emails, and stakeouts and surveillance, they chipped away at Victor's empire, gathering evidence, building a case. But Victor was always one step ahead. Every lead they chased down turned into a dead end. Every witness they approached disappeared or turned up dead. It was as if he had eyes and ears everywhere, an invisible web of influence that stretched further than they could even imagine. Through it all, Daniel found himself drawn further and further into their world. He told himself it was for Sarah, for the fire in her eyes and the kindness in her smile. He told himself it was for Maverick, for the loyalty and trust in those brown eyes. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was tired of running from the shadows in his past. Tired of feeling helpless in the face of all the darkness in the world. This was his chance to make a stand, to fight for something bigger than himself. But the harder they fought, the more dangerous the game became. There were close calls, narrow escapes. They'd barely make it back to the cabin, hearts pounding, adrenaline singing in their veins. It was in those moments, when death brushed close enough to leave them cold, that Daniel and Sarah found solace in each other. A touch that lingered, a glance heavy with meaning. In a world of chaos and danger, they were each other's anchor, each other's safe harbor. But the storm was far from over. Victor's web was tightening around them, the shadows growing longer with each passing day. They were running out of time, running out of options. And Maverick, ever watchful, ever loyal, could sense the danger brewing. He never left Sarah's side, a silent guardian, a fierce protector. But even he couldn't stop what was coming. The final confrontation was looming on the horizon, dark and inevitable. It was time to make their move, to roll the dice and hope their luck held out. Because if it didn't, if Victor won, there would be no coming back from that. Only silence and shadow, and the cold embrace of the grave. The plan was simple in concept, but dangerous in execution. They'd use Maverick as bait, dangle him like a carrot in front of Victor's nose. The crime lord's obsession with tying up loose ends would be his downfall. Sarah would pose as a potential buyer, claiming to have captured the missing dog. She'd arrange a meeting with Victor, drawing him out into the open. Daniel and the rest of the team would be waiting, ready to spring the trap. It was a risky gambit, putting Sarah and Maverick directly in the line of fire. But it was the only way to get close enough to Victor to take him down. The night of the meet was cold and moonless, the sky a vast, empty void. They gathered in the shadows of the abandoned warehouse Sarah had chosen for the encounter, breath fogging in the chill air. Sarah checked her wire for the 100th time, her face pale but determined in the harsh glare of the floodlights. Maverick sat at her side, ears pricked, body coiled with tension. Daniel and the others fanned out, taking up positions around the perimeter. They blended into the darkness, guns drawn, hearts pounding in the stillness. The purr of an engine shattered the silence, headlights cutting through the gloom. A sleek black car rolled to a stop, the door swinging open to reveal a figure that seemed to be carved from shadow itself. Victor Langley stepped into the light, his eyes cold and dead as a shark's. He was flanked by two heavily armed guards, their faces impassive, their stances ready. You have something of mine, he said, his voice soft and menacing. Sarah stood her ground, chin lifted, one hand resting on Maverick's head. And you have something of mine, she replied. The evidence you stole, the witnesses you silenced. It ends tonight, Victor. The crime lord smiled, a thin, cruel slash of a thing. Oh, my dear Detective Whitmore. You have no idea how wrong you are. What happened next was a blur of motion and sound. Victor's men surged forward, guns drawn. Sarah shoved Maverick behind her, her own weapon leaping into her hands. Daniel and the others charged from the shadows, shouts and gunfire rending the air. The night exploded into chaos, into blood and violence and the sickening crunch of bone. They were outnumbered, outgunned. But they had surprise on their side, and desperation, and the kind of courage that only comes when you're fighting for something bigger than yourself. And they had Maverick. The loyal dog leapt into the fray with a snarl, a whirlwind of fur and fury. He took down one of Victor's men, then another, his teeth flashing, his eyes blazing with a fierce, protective light. But even he couldn't be everywhere at once. And when the shot rang out, when Sarah cried out and fell, clutching her side, Daniel felt the world tilt and shatter around him. He surged forward, heedless of the bullets whining past his head, of the hands grasping at him, trying to hold him back. All he could see was Sarah, the blood spreading beneath her fingers, the light fading from her eyes. He reached her side, gathered her into his arms. Maverick crouched over them, snarling at anything that dared come close. Hold on, Daniel pleaded, his voice cracking. Just hold on, Sarah. Help is coming. Just stay with me. But even as the words left his mouth, he could feel her slipping away. And as the sirens wailed in the distance, as the flashing lights painted the blood-soaked concrete in shades of red and blue, Daniel held her close and prayed to a God he'd long since stopped believing in for a miracle he knew would never come. Time lost all meaning in the sterile white halls of the hospital. Minutes bled into hours, hours into days, the steady beep of the heart monitor the only marker of its passage. Daniel sat at Sarah's bedside, Maverick curled at his feet. The loyal dog hadn't left his side since the ambulance ride, since the frantic rush of doctors and nurses, the shouts for blood and saline and emergency surgery. Sarah lay still and pale against the sheets, her chest rising and falling with the mechanical pulse of the ventilator. The doctors said it was a miracle she'd made it this far, that the bullet had missed her heart by mere millimeters. But they couldn't say when or if she'd wake up. So Daniel waited. He talked to her, read to her, held her hand and willed her to come back to him. Maverick whined and nuzzled her still fingers, his brown eyes mournful and confused. The rest of the team came and went, hollow-eyed and heartsick. They brought coffee and sandwiches, and sat with Daniel in silent solidarity. But there was an emptiness to their presence, a grief that went beyond words. Because while Sarah fought for her life, Victor was still out there. The raid had been a failure, the evidence lost in the chaos of the firefight. The crime lord had slipped away like smoke on the wind, leaving only blood and bitter ashes in his wake. It felt like a cruel twist of fate, like the universe was mocking their efforts, their sacrifices. They had given everything, risked everything, and still it wasn't enough. But Daniel refused to give up hope. He clung to it like a drowning man to a life raft, like a flame in the darkness. Sarah was strong, a fighter. If anyone could claw their way back from the brink, it was her. So he kept his vigil, day after day, night after sleepless night. He watched the shadows lengthen and the seasons change outside the hospital window. And he prayed, to whatever powers might be listening, for a miracle. Weeks turned to months, summer fading into the crisp chill of autumn. The leaves turned gold and red, drifting down from the trees like the last embers of a dying fire. And still, Sarah slept. The doctors weaned her off the ventilator, watched with cautious optimism as she began to breathe on her own. But she remained lost in the depths of her own mind, wandering in dreams Daniel could only guess at. He talked to her every day, his voice growing hoarse and ragged with use. He told her about his past, about the shadows that haunted him, the guilt that gnawed at his soul. He spoke of the future, of the life he wanted to build with her, the love that had taken root in his heart when he wasn't looking. Maverick listened, his head resting on his paws, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. It was as if he understood every word, as if he too was willing her to wake, to come back to them. And then, one crisp October morning, a miracle. Daniel was dozing in the chair by the bed, his hand resting on Sarah's, when he felt her fingers twitch. His eyes flew open, his heart leaping into his throat. "Sarah," he whispered, hardly daring to breathe. Her eyelids fluttered, her lips parting on a sigh. And then, slowly, painfully, she opened her eyes. "Daniel." Her voice was a thin rasp, barely audible. What happened?" He couldn't speak past the lump in his throat, past the overwhelming surge of relief and joy and gratitude. He gathered her into his arms, pressing his face into her hair, feeling the warmth of her, the steady thrum of her heartbeat. Maverick whined and wiggled, his tail wagging so hard his whole body shook. He licked Sarah's face, making her laugh, the sound weak but genuine. "We thought we lost you," Daniel said finally, pulling back to look at her. "You've been asleep for so long." Her brow furrowed, memories flickering behind her eyes. "Victor?" she asked, her voice hardening. Daniel shook his head. "He got away. After the raid, it was chaos. We couldn't find him." Sarah closed her eyes, grief and anger and exhaustion warring on her face. "Then it was all for nothing," she said dully. "All that pain, all that sacrifice." "No." Daniel took her face in his hands, made her look at him. "Not for nothing. We're still here. We're still fighting. And we won't stop until Victor is brought to justice. I promise you, Sarah. We'll finish this, together." She searched his face, saw the love and determination shining in his eyes. And slowly, tentatively, she smiled. "Together," she echoed, lacing her fingers with his. "I like the sound of that." Sarah's recovery was slow, the progress measured in tiny increments. Learning to walk again, to breathe without pain, to face the world with a body and mind forever altered by violence and trauma. But she was not alone. Daniel was with her every step of the way, his love and support an unwavering beacon in the darkness. And Maverick, loyal and true, a constant shadow at her side. The rest of the team rallied around her, their shared purpose forging bonds that went beyond friendship, beyond family. They were soldiers in a war that had no end, warriors fighting for a cause that was bigger than any one of them. Because Victor was still out there, his criminal empire weakened but not broken. He had gone to ground after the failed raid, vanished into the shadows like a wraith. But they knew he would resurface eventually, knew that his hunger for power and control could never be sated. So they planned and plotted, gathered their strength and their resources. Sarah threw herself into physical therapy with a fierce determination, pushing herself to the limits of endurance and beyond. Daniel trained with Maverick, honing the dog's already formidable skills, forging a partnership built on trust and respect. And slowly, piece by piece, they began to rebuild what Victor had tried to destroy. The evidence that had been lost was painstakingly reconstructed, witnesses coaxed out of hiding with promises of protection and justice. It was a long road, a hard road. There were setbacks and frustrations, moments of doubt and despair. But through it all, they had each other. And that was enough. Until the day the message came. A single sheet of paper slipped under the door of Sarah's hospital room. On it, a set of coordinates, a date, and a time. And beneath that, a single word, written in a hand they all recognized. Endgame. The location was a remote stretch of forest, miles from the nearest town. They went in under cover of darkness, Maverick ranging ahead, his senses alert for any sign of danger. Daniel and Sarah followed close behind, weapons drawn, hearts pounding in the stillness. The rest of the team fanned out behind them, a silent, invisible presence in the shadows. They found Victor waiting for them in a clearing, his face pale and gaunt in the moonlight. He was alone, unarmed, his hands spread wide in a gesture of surrender. "Detective Whitmore," he said, his voice soft and mocking. "You're the one. You're 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 the one. You I see you've recovered from our last encounter. Sarah's grip tightened on her gun, her jaw clenching. It's over, Victor, she said, her voice cold and steady. You've got nowhere to run. The crime lord smiled, a thin, humorless thing. Oh, I'm not running, he said. I'm here to offer you a deal. Daniel and Sarah exchanged a glance, wary and disbelieving. What kind of deal? Daniel asked, his finger hovering over the trigger of his gun. Victor's smile widened. The kind that will ensure your survival, he said. I have information, evidence that could bring down some very powerful people. People who make me look like a small-time crook by comparison. Sarah shook her head. And in exchange for this information, you want what? Immunity? A get-out-of-jail-free card? No, Victor said, his voice hardening. I want protection. For myself and for my family. I want to disappear, to start a new life somewhere far away from here. Daniel barked a harsh laugh. And why should we trust you? He demanded. After everything you've done, all the lives you've destroyed? Victor's gaze cut to him, sharp and assessing. Because, Mr. Carter, he said softly, you of all people should know that sometimes, the only way to survive is to make a deal with the devil. Daniel went still, his blood turning to ice in his veins. Beside him, Sarah frowned, confusion and suspicion warring on her face. What is he talking about? She asked, her eyes never leaving Victor's face. The crime lord smile turned sly, knowing. Oh, he hasn't told you, he asked, his voice dripping with false sympathy. About his past, about the things he's done? The blood on his hands? Sarah turned to Daniel, her expression hardening. Is it true? She demanded, her voice tight with betrayal and hurt. Daniel closed his eyes, shame and grief and old pain rising up to choke him. Sarah, he said, his voice cracking. I wanted to tell you. But I was afraid you'd see me differently. See me for the monster I really am. Maverick whined, pressing close to Daniel's side, his warmth and solidity a small comfort in the face of Sarah's anger and Victor's cruel triumph. I think, Victor said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife, that it's time for the truth to come out, don't you, Mr. Carter? Daniel's past unfurled like a dark and twisted fairy tale, each word dragged from him like a barbed hook from flesh. He spoke of his time in the military, of covert ops and black bag missions, the things he'd seen and done in the name of duty and country. He spoke of the innocent lives lost, the collateral damage brushed aside in the pursuit of a greater good that seemed to recede further with each passing day. He spoke of the final mission, the one that broke him, shattered him into pieces. The intel that was wrong, the target that turned out to be a civilian, a mother and her child. The split-second decision that haunted him still, the guilt that ate at him like a cancer. And he spoke of the deal he'd made, the devil he'd bargained with to escape the consequences of his actions. The new identity, the new life, bought and paid for with the blood of the innocent. Through it all, Sarah listened, her face a mask of stone, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Maverick pressed close to her side, offering what comfort he could, his gaze never leaving Daniel's face. When it was over, when the last word had been spoken and the silence stretched thin and taut between them, Victor smiled, a shark scenting blood in the water. You see, detective, he said, his voice soft and poisonous. We're not so different, he and I. We've both done what was necessary to survive, to protect what matters most to us. Sarah shook her head, her gun never wavering from its aim at Victor's heart. No, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You're a monster, Victor. A murderer and a liar. And you'll pay for your crimes, one way or another. She turned to Daniel, her eyes searching his face. And you, she said, her voice softening. You're not that person anymore. The man I know, the man I love, he's kind and brave and good. He's the man who saved Maverick, who fought by my side, who never gave up on me even when I gave up on myself. Daniel felt something break open inside him, some hard, cold knot of fear and self-loathing that had lived in his chest for longer than he could remember. He reached for Sarah, heedless of the gun in her hand, the danger still lurking in the shadows. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his forehead pressed to hers. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. For everything." She shook her head, her free hand coming up to cup his cheek. "No more secrets," she said softly. "No more lies. From here on out, we face everything together. No matter what." Maverick barked, a sharp, warning sound that snapped them back to the present, to the threat still standing before them. Victor's face had gone hard and cold, his eyes flat and reptilian in the moonlight. "How touching," he sneered. "But I'm afraid I have no intention of paying for my crimes, detective. Not now, not ever." He reached into his pocket, drew out a small, black device. A dead man's switch, wired to enough explosives to level a city block. "I told you," he said, his voice gone soft and deadly. "I want protection. And if I don't get it, if you don't let me walk away from this, then none of us will." The moment stretched, taut and breathless, the whole world balanced on the edge of a knife. Victor's finger hovered over the switch, his eyes daring them to make a move, to call his bluff. Daniel's mind raced, desperate for a solution, for a way out that didn't end in blood and fire and death. But there was nothing, no clever trick or last-minute miracle that could save them now. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw Maverick move. The dog shifted, a subtle tensing of muscles, a flicker of intent in his keen gaze. And Daniel understood, with a sudden, blinding clarity, what he intended to do. "Maverick, no." The words tore from his throat, a desperate, futile plea. But it was too late. The dog lunged, a blur of fur and fury, his powerful jaws clamping down on Victor's arm. The crime lord screamed, the sound high and thin and terrible, his fingers spasming on the trigger of the dead man's switch. But Maverick was faster, his teeth sinking deep, his weight bearing Victor to the ground. The device fell from nerveless fingers, skittering across the forest floor, the blinking red light of the detonator casting a hellish glow in the darkness. Daniel moved, his body reacting on pure instinct, years of training taking over. He dove for the device, scooped it up, hurled it with all his strength into the trees. The explosion was deafening, a blast of heat and force that knocked him flat, drove the breath from his lungs. He lay stunned, ears ringing, the world spinning madly around him. And then Sarah was there, her hands on his face, her voice calling his name. He blinked up at her, dazed and disoriented, the taste of blood thick on his tongue. "Daniel? Daniel, can you hear me?" Her voice was tight with fear, her eyes bright with tears. "I'm okay," he managed, struggling to sit up. "I'm okay, Sarah." Where's Maverick?" She turned, scanning the clearing, her face going pale and stricken. "Oh God," she whispered. "No." Daniel followed her gaze, his heart seizing in his chest. Maverick lay sprawled on the ground, his fur matted with blood, his body still and lifeless. Victor lay beside him, his throat torn out, his sightless eyes staring up at the uncaring stars. Victor lay beside him, his throat torn out, his sightless eyes staring up at the uncaring stars. Daniel staggered to his feet, stumbled to the fallen dog's side. He fell to his knees, gathered Maverick into his arms, heedless of the blood, the ruin of torn flesh and shattered bone. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking in a sob. "No, buddy, please. Don't do this. Don't leave me." But Maverick was gone, his brave heart stilled, his fierce, loyal spirit fled. He had given his life to save theirs, had made the ultimate sacrifice for the humans he loved more than life itself. Sarah knelt beside him, her arms going around them both, her tears mingling with his own. They clung to each other in the darkness, mourning the friend, the partner, the hero who had saved them all. They buried Maverick at dawn, as the first light of morning touched the eastern sky. They dug the grave together, there in the clearing where he had fallen, where he had made his final stand against the evil that had threatened to consume them all. Daniel placed him in the earth with gentle hands, his heart aching with a grief too deep for words. Sarah lay a blanket over him, smoothed the dirt with trembling fingers. They stood together over the fresh-turned earth, hands clasped, tears flowing freely. They spoke no eulogies, made no grand speeches. There were no words that could capture what Maverick had meant to them, what he had given, what he had been. He was a warrior, a guardian, a friend. He was the best of them, the bravest and the strongest and the truest. He had loved them with a fierce, unwavering devotion, and had stood by their side through every trial and every sorrow. And in the end, he had given his life for theirs, had made the choice that only a hero could make. He had saved them, not just from Victor, but from themselves, from the secrets and the lies and the wounds that had festered for so long in the dark. They would remember him always, would carry his memory in their hearts like a flame, like a guiding star. They would honor him with every breath, with every beat of their hearts, with every step they took into a future that he had bought for them with his blood. And they would love each other with the same fierce, unwavering devotion that he had shown them. They would build a life together, a family, a home. They would face whatever challenges lay ahead with the strength and the courage that he had taught them, with the unbreakable bond that he had forged between them. For Maverick, for the loyal dog who had saved them all, they would live. And they would never, ever forget. Epilogue. Years pass, as years must. The world turns, seasons change, and life goes on. Daniel and Sarah marry in the spring, in a small ceremony filled with laughter and tears and the sweet scent of new beginnings. They exchange vows under a canopy of blossoming trees, Maverick's tags nestled close to their hearts. They buy a house on the edge of town, with a big yard and room to grow. They fill it with love and light and the happy barks of the dogs they adopt, the ones that no one else wants, the ones that need them most. Daniel goes back to school, earns a degree in social work. He counsels veterans struggling with the same demons he once faced, helps them find their way back to the light. Sarah takes over the detective agency, rebuilds it from the ground up, makes it a force for justice and compassion in a world too often short on both. They have their struggles, their moments of doubt and darkness. But they face them together, hand in hand, heart to heart. They lean on each other, draw strength from the love that grows deeper and stronger with every passing day. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, they feel a presence at their side, a warmth and a weight that is achingly familiar. They turn, half expecting to see him there, tall and proud and forever at their side. And though they know it's impossible, though they know he's gone, they swear they can almost hear the thump of his tail, the soft huff of his breath. They can almost feel the brush of his fur against their fingers, the solid strength of him leaning into their legs. In those moments, they smile through their tears, and they whisper his name like a prayer, like a promise. Maverick, the loyal dog, the brave warrior, the true friend. He is with them always, a part of them, woven into their story like a shining thread of gold. And they know, with a certainty that goes beyond words, beyond thought, that they are blessed, that they are loved, that they are never, ever alone. For in the end, that is Maverick's true legacy, his greatest gift. Not the battles he fought, not the enemies he vanquished, but the love he shared, the hearts he touched, the lives he changed forever. A love that knows no bounds, that fears no darkness, that endures beyond the veil of death itself. A love that is eternal, unbreakable, and forever true. So they carry on, Daniel and Sarah, living the life that Maverick gave them. They laugh and they cry, they fight and they make up, they face each day with courage and with grace. They hold each other close, and they never let go. And through it all, through every joy and every sorrow, every triumph and every trial, they feel him with them, a constant presence, a guiding light. Maverick, the dog who saved them, the friend who loved them, the hero who will live forever in their hearts. Until the day they meet again, at the Rainbow Bridge, where all good dogs go. Where the grass is soft and green, where the sun is always shining, and where the love never ends. And on that day, they will run to him, and he will run to them, and they will be together again, forever and always. A family, a pack, bound by a love that is stronger than time, stronger than death, stronger than anything in this world or the next. For that is the promise of the Rainbow Bridge, the promise of love eternal. And it is a promise that Maverick will keep, now and forever, until the end of time itself.